This story was submitted by Creep Factor. What is the shortest period of time you've ever held a job? A couple of days? A week? Less? For me, it was 16 days. I was 21 and paying my way through college. The job market was scarce and I had few options, so I took up a job at Sunset House as a security guard. Now understand, I cannot tell you the real name of this establishment due to legal reasons. I will tell you this much, it's a combination rehab facility and mental institution. My shift was from 10 p.m. to 5 a.m. It wasn't too bad, at first. I had to deal with the screaming people going through withdrawals and the occasional person having a fit of insanity, but I had the other security guards to back me up if things got out of hand. All was going peachy, until night 16. Owen, the other security guard, came down with food poisoning, so they called in Gary to be my backup. Gary was under investigation, but was somehow still working. Our boss had noticed medication missing after his shifts were over. Knowing this, I was unhappy. I knew I would have to keep an eye on him as well as the patients. It was about 1:45 in the morning when I noticed one of the patients wandering around the hallways. He was peering into the rooms as if he were looking for something. I tapped Gary on the shoulder and told him to take a look. "Oh, don't worry about him. That's just Mr. Rogers. He's curious, but harmless. He's a burnout. Dropped too much acid in the 70s. It's fried his brain." I asked Gary if I should help him find his way to his room, and Gary smiled from ear to ear. "I have to use the bathroom. After I get back, be my guest." The interaction between us didn't mean much until recently, but plainly, he knew I was in for it and he was a scumbag. 20 minutes passed, and I could see Mr. Rogers steadily walking from room to room, still peering through the open doors. I felt uneasy, despite what Gary had told me. I left the guard station and walked through the corridor where the men's restroom was located. When I looked down, I saw a white oval-shaped pill on the floor. I wasn't sure what it was, so I picked it up and pocketed it. I would look into it later, but first I was going to check up on Gary. I walked into the dimly lit bathroom and called out Gary's name. No response. I began opening the stalls one by one, finally reaching stall 4. There was my backup, passed out on the toilet, fast asleep. Fucking great. I poked him and he let out a snore. "Come on, man, wake the hell up. Roger is still wandering the halls and I need you to help me get him back in his room." Gary woke up for a second and looked at me with glassy, bloodshot eyes. "He's a fucking beanpole. You don't need my help. I told you he was harmless. Do it yourself." Angrily, I stormed through the door and back to my post. I immediately checked the cameras to see Mr. Rogers sitting by a water fountain rocking back and forth. I picked up my clipboard and scanned the patient log until I found his room number, room 703. It was on the other side of the hospital. I grabbed my pepper spray just in case I needed it, hopefully not, and then I started making my way to his location. It took me a few minutes, but I finally reached him. He was still rocking back and forth, muttering something to himself. I couldn't entirely make it out, but it was eerily familiar. "Don't overthink this. Just help him back to his room," I kept saying in my head. As I progressed towards him, he looked up at me. "Hey man, have you seen my dog?" he asked. I helped him to his feet and told him calmly and honestly, "Sorry man, no dogs allowed in here." He nodded at me and stood up. "Come on bud, let's go back to your room." I walked next to him and kept him in my sight. No matter how harmless he was, I knew I had to keep an eye on him. I kept walking with him and began making small talk. "So how long have you been here?" I asked. He looked at me and said, "What's your name, man?" I smiled at him and calmly said, "Freddy. My name is Freddy." He nodded at me again, his voice still shaky. "I don't know, Freddy. Feels like it's been forever. I have some friends, but they never visit anymore." Hearing this made me feel really bad for him. "Why were you looking around if you don't mind me asking?" I said.
"I was getting hungry. I felt like a bologna sandwich, so I wanted to try to find the kitchen."
This clued me in a bit as to how severe his condition had been. He said he'd been here forever, so he should have known that the kitchen was located downstairs. "Sorry about that. The kitchen is closed this late at night," I said to him. He looked forlorn and nodded at me again. Before I knew it, we were back at his room, and I opened the door and asked him to go in. His demeanor changed in an instant. He went from skittish and talkative to scared and hostile.
"No way! No way! I am not going back in there!"
he yelled as he spun around and grabbed me. Now bear in mind, I'm 6'3" and roughly 270 pounds. This guy was 5'9" and maybe 140, and yet he somehow overpowered me, knocking me to the ground. He sat on my chest and began raining in punches, each one growing in ferocity. I arched my back and rolled sideways, throwing him off balance, but in the process my pepper spray got knocked loose. Mr. Rogers saw it on the floor before I did, and sprayed it directly in my face. I lay there on the ground and struggled to breathe. He got my eyes, nose, and mouth. Though my vision was blurry, I could see him dart off around the corner, throwing the pepper spray behind him. I don't know which was worse, the feeling of my lungs sputtering to get air into my body, or the feeling of what I can only describe of being battery acid in my eyes. I got up to my hands and knees and began to retch. I vomited a bit and began calling out to Gary. After what seemed like an eternity, he came staggering around the corner.
"Oh shit! Oh shit! Oh shit!"
was all he could get out as he saw me practically helpless on the floor. "Harmless, huh?" I angrily shouted at him.
"Where is he?"
I pointed towards the corner and Gary took off down the hall. A minute or so later, I heard a heavy door slam and get locked shut. Gary came racing around the corner and informed me that the patient was sitting in the quiet room, staring into the corner. He helped me to my feet and guided me to the men's room, where I washed off as much of the spray as I could out of my eyes. Gary begged me not to call Carl, our chief of staff. Fuck that. As soon as I was able to get to the guard booth, I grabbed my cell phone. I texted Carl, code orange, and within 10 minutes he showed up with a scowl on his face. He told Gary to stand outside of the booth, and he took down my statement. Before Carl could call Gary in, I reached into my pocket and handed Carl the pill I'd found earlier. He looked at it and his face went flush with anger.
"Xanax. That's a fucking Xanax,"
was all he could say. He politely asked me to stand outside of the booth and called Gary in. The door barely closed behind him when Carl began to read him the riot act. I tried my best not to pay attention to the scolding. Key word, tried. The booth was almost soundproof from the outside. It was made that way in case a patient started to freak out during intake. But when Carl yelled out,
"Badge, now,"
I heard that loud and clear. I walked into the men's room corridor to avoid any further conflict. I could hear Gary using language that would make a pimp cry as he stormed towards the elevators. As the door separating us and the exit slammed shut, Carl approached me. He began to calm down a bit. He told me that I had breached protocol by approaching a level 3 patient without backup. "What do you mean level 3? I asked him. I never saw that on the patient log. Talk about a lack of communication. Carl's response was,
"He's been here since 1986. He attacked a girl in his van after a drug trip gone bad. He's been here in the state's custody ever since."
In short, this patient had a violent history and has been here for 27 years, and it wasn't documented on the patient log. I quit on the spot. Flash forward to present day. I graduated college and began working as a drug counselor at none other than Sunset House. Despite everything that had happened, I was never angry at the patient. After all, he was there for a reason. The rehab facility is located 1 floor below the mental facility, so there's a little less for me to worry about. Carl is still here, and there's no hard feelings between us. Occasionally we get coffee together in the lounge. We talk about our day, and I can honestly say that we're pretty good friends. I reluctantly revisited those events with him last night over a cup of coffee. I told him about the rocking back and forth while muttering, and then I told him I felt like I knew he was saying something, but I wasn't entirely sure. He put his hands on my shoulder and said,
"Well, Freddy, it should be familiar. He's saying, 'Scooby-Doo, where are you?'"
This story was submitted by Adam. This happened a couple of years ago when I was 11. It was about 8 p.m. and I was eating dinner with my family at a restaurant. The way the restaurant entrance was set up was that there was a tiny room you went through with one of those skill cranes before you actually enter the restaurant, and right in front of that is where you wait to be seated at your table. Our booth sat to the right of this little entrance room. While I was eating, I looked up to the room, which had a window that was facing me, and saw a creepy-looking homeless man. I'll try to describe him the best that I can remember him. He was an Asian man, and had a slight mustache. He had dirty and frizzled hair, and he only had one shoe on. He wore a dirty red plaid robe, and was holding a pillow and a teddy bear. Yes, a teddy bear, in one hand, and a small bucket in the other. As he took a few steps, I noticed that he had a limp. He slowly turned his head to me and stared at me creepily. I was really creeped out, so I switched seats with my dad since I was sitting at the opening of the booth. The man went up to the waiter and asked her for water like this.
"Water."
Weirded out, the waiter went back to the kitchen with his bucket to get him some water. While the waiter was gone, the homeless man slowly limped back to my table. My dad asked him, "What the hell do you want?" The man replied,
"Him,"
pointing at me. I screamed, and he limped out of the restaurant without even getting his water. Then he went to the window and stared coldly at me for about 5 seconds, before limping away. The waiter rushed over immediately, apologizing and offering to change our seats in case he comes back. About 2 or 3 minutes later, he does come back. I see the chef look at him, and the man just runs out with no limp at all. They have one of the biggest waiters they have walk us to our car just in case the man is still there. And I guess they called the cops because I saw several cop cars rush to the restaurant. Unfortunately, it doesn't end there. About an hour after we got back to our house, the doorbell rang. I made my way over to the door wondering why someone would ring the doorbell at 9 at night. When I opened the door, my heart sank. The same homeless man was grinning evilly at me, and I noticed something shiny and sharp in the pocket of his robe. I screamed, and my dad got his baseball bat and chased the man. The cops were called, and they found him running a few streets away. Apparently he had a full list of mental issues, such as schizophrenia and other mental disorders. He was put away in a mental institution and has been there ever since. Sometimes I have nightmares about that man escaping and kidnapping me from my house. If you enjoyed this video, you know what to do. If you would like a chance to have your story featured in an upcoming video, make sure you check out the description for information on how to submit your stories. Now, before I get into my thoughts on the stories, I wanted to let you know that if you were interested in roasting me, I actually have an ongoing roast on Reddit. I'll include a link in the description if you would like to participate. Around my birthday next month, I'll go ahead and pick a couple of the best burns, and I'll read them on my channel. So I hope to see a few of you over there. Now, in the first story, I think the scariest part of this whole incident isn't the person, but the fact that they didn't document why this person was in there. Kinda like you were stating. This whole situation could have easily have been avoided had they properly documented it, which is the exact reason you quit. Even though you work in a different department now, hopefully you don't have to worry about their discrepancies. Now for the second story. Fortunately, your whole family was there to witness this guy. And even luckier, the police were able to get there in time and get this guy the help he needed. By the sounds of it, he wasn't doing too well out on the streets. I hope you all have a great day, and I'll catch you in the next video. And just remember, it's always scarier if it's true.